So now that we're familiar with the basic anatomy of the heart, we can discuss blood flow through the heart. Blood flows in a single direction through the heart, and we're going to see that two sets of valves will help accomplish this task. When the atria contract, they will push blood through a set of valves called the atrioventricular valves. These are also referred to as the cuspid valves, and that blood will be pushed from the atria into the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, the pressure in the ventricles is going to close the atrioventricular valves, and it's going to open another set of valves called the semilunar valves, which are situated between the ventricles and the great arteries, so that is the pulmonary trunk or the aorta. We're going to see that the valves will open in response to the difference in pressure on each side of the valve, and this applies to both the atrioventricular valves as well as the semilunar valves. So as mentioned previously, the atrioventricular valves, which are also called the cuspid valves, are situated between the atria and the ventricles. The tricuspid valve is located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. The bicuspid valve is located between the left atrium and the left ventricle. The semilunar valves are found between the ventricles and the great arteries, like the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Here, the semilunar valves are identified as either the aortic valve or the pulmonary valve. The aortic valve is situated between the left ventricle and the aorta. The pulmonary valve is situated between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So let's examine how the atrioventricular valves work. So blood that is returning to the atria will begin to fill the atria, and in doing so, it's going to put pressure against the atrioventricular valves. Eventually, the pressure in the atria will be high enough to force the valves open, and blood will flow from the atria to the ventricles. And then the atria will contract, which is going to force a little bit more blood into the ventricles. So when the ventricles contract, the atrioventricular valves are going to prevent backflow of blood into the atria. This is because when the ventricles contract, the blood within them is going to build up pressure, and this increase in pressure in the ventricles is what causes the flaps of the valves to catch blood, much like air is caught in a parachute. The flaps of the valves are going to snap together and close, and as the ventricles contract, the papillary muscles will also contract, which are going to put tension on those chordae tendineae. So recall that the chordae tendineae behave as tethers that are going to anchor the atrioventricular flaps when the valves are closed. So this helps to close the valves without the ends of the valves blowing back up into the atria, and along with it, blood flowing back up into the atria along with it. So let's review here. The tricuspid valve will be open when the right atrium pressure is greater than the right ventricle pressure. And the same goes for the left side. The bicuspid, which is also known as the mitral valve, will be open when the left atrium pressure is greater than the left ventricle pressure. The valves will close when the pressure in the ventricles is going to be greater than the pressure in the atria. And ventricular pressure will be greater than atrial pressure when the ventricles are contracting. So therefore, we're going to see that the tricuspid valve will be closed when the right atrium pressure is less than the right ventricle pressure. And the bicuspid or the mitral valve is going to be closed when the left atrium pressure is going to be less than the left ventricle pressure. And again, the pressure in the atria will be lower than the pressure in the ventricles when the ventricles are contracting. The semilunar valves are going to prevent backflow of blood from the great arteries, that is the pulmonary trunk or the aorta, into the ventricles after the ventricles relax. When the ventricles contract, we're going to see, just as we saw a moment ago, that the pressure in them will rise. And this pressure is going to put pressure on those semilunar valve flaps, and it will eventually cause them to open. So that is when the ventricular pressure exceeds the pressure that's in these large arteries. So, however, as the ventricles relax and the pressure inside of the ventricles begins to drop, blood will begin flowing back from the arteries toward the ventricles. The cusps of the semilunar valves will catch the backflowing blood and snap closed. thereby closing the valve. So in summary, what we see is that the pulmonary semilunar valve will be open when the right ventricle pressure is greater than the pressure in the pulmonary trunk. And similarly, the aortic semilunar valve is going to be open when the left ventricle pressure is greater than the pressure that's seen in the aorta. So on the other hand, the pulmonary semilunar valve will close when the pressure in the right ventricle is less than the pulmonary trunk pressure, and the aortic semilunar valve will be closed when the left ventricle pressure is less than the pressure that is observed in the aorta. A couple of things that can go wrong with valves is that valves could be incompetent, which means that they do not close properly. Incompetent valves will allow blood to leak back into the chamber that that blood had just left from or just exited from. So as a result, the heart will pump the same volume of blood over and over due to this backflow, meaning that the heart is going to have to unnecessarily work harder to move that volume of blood. Another condition called valvular stenosis is where the valves become stiffened due to calcium deposits or scar tissue. A couple of causes, particularly in the scar tissue area, is that scar tissue can build up on these valves by rheumatic fever, which is inflammation of the joints, the blood vessels, or the heart. Another cause of scar tissue buildup could be endocarditis, which is an infection or inflammation of the endocardium, which also can affect the valves as well. So with stenosis, the diameter of the valve is constricted when they are open because they do not open very well, and they don't close properly either. So again, here the heart has to work harder because it's essentially pumping the same volume of blood over and over because the improper function in the valves permits backflow. So faulty valves or damaged valves can be replaced with valves from several different sources, including mechanical valves that are man-made from synthetic materials. Humans can also receive replacement valves from animal sources, such as bovine, which are cow hearts, or porcine, which are pig hearts. They can also be replaced from human cadavers, which means that the valve that is going to be transplanted is a natural human heart valve from someone who has died. So in summary here, we're going to see that recall that the right atrium is going to receive deoxygenated blood from three veins: the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, and the coronary sinus, even though the coronary sinus is not shown here in this diagram. The opening for it is shown, but the actual vein itself is not shown. So as the right atrium begins to fill with blood from those three veins, that blood is going to put pressure on the right atrioventricular valve, which is also known as the tricuspid valve, which will open the valve, and blood is going to begin to flow from the right atrium into the right ventricle. Atrial contraction will help to squeeze a little bit more blood into the right ventricle, just to make sure that the ventricle is full before the ventricle contracts. So when the right ventricle eventually contracts, the pressure will rise in the right ventricle. It's going to close the tricuspid valve, but at the same time, it's also going to open the pulmonary semilunar valve, which will push blood into the pulmonary arteries, and then from there, that blood will go to the lungs. So in the capillaries of the lungs, that's where blood will pick up oxygen, and then it's going to be returned to the heart through the pulmonary veins. The left atrium is going to receive oxygenated blood from those pulmonary veins. And as the left atrium begins to fill, it will also put pressure on the left atrioventricular valve, which is called the bicuspid valve. This is going to open the valve, and blood will begin to flow from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Atrial contraction here will also help to squeeze a little bit more blood from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Eventually, when the left ventricle does contract, the pressure in the ventricle is going to rise, which will cause the left atrioventricular valve, the bicuspid valve, to close, and it will also cause the aortic semilunar valve to open, which is going to push blood into the aorta and to the systemic circuit. Blood in those systemic capillaries is going to deliver some of its oxygen to the tissues as well as any of the nutrients that it's carrying. And in delivering its blood, that blood is going to become less oxygenated than it was previously. So it's going to deliver some of that oxygen, and that deoxygenated blood will be returned to the heart through those veins that we had just discussed, like the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. So the systemic circuit is a long, high-friction circuit due to the high number of blood vessels. Blood pressure tends to be highest in the systemic circuit, which is why the walls of the left ventricle are much thicker than those of the right ventricle. The left ventricle has to contract much more forcefully and generate much higher pressures than the right ventricle does in order to move the same volume of blood. So typically the walls of the left ventricle are about 3 times thicker than the walls of the right ventricle, which we see very easily in this diagram here.